Hello and welcome to this, the first of a new study that we're doing on Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. This is a classic. It's been around for a long time. It was based on a series of radio broadcasts that Lewis gave during World War II, most of them beginning in about 1941. They would be collected later and put into this book, Mere Christianity, in 1952. So isn't it a little amazing that a book written 69 years ago and from talks given nearly 80 years ago, that this would continue to be a classic in literature? There's an estimate that this book sells about 150,000 copies still a year. And if you add all those years together, that means that well over 10 million copies of the book have been sold. I've met numerous people throughout the years who are familiar with this book, and I'll hear things such as, I tried to read it, I couldn't get through it, I didn't understand it, to I didn't know what to make of it, to the wonderful one that says it was the turning point in my Christian faith. So you can see why people still pick it up and look at it and ponder it today as they move forward. And that's what we're going to be doing. If you received this video by a link that I sent to you, then you also received a handout associated with it. And it's simply a place that you can take notes, and where I have recorded some of the notes that I'm going to be having on the screen for you already. But there's also a timeline of Lewis's life that's associated with that. And I invite you to look at that. I kind of divided it out and as to what was his autobiographical data, what was there about his faith, and then about all the books that he's published throughout his lifetime. So I hope that you have a book. I hope that you have had a chance to read it, and invite you to, move with us as we delve into this particular study. Now, the book itself is divided into more books, if you will. And actually, it's divided into 4 major books. Now, each of those major books has a series of chapters in it. This week, we're going to be looking at book 1, which is really chapters 1 through 5 of book 1. Next week, we'll look at books 2, which is chapters 1 through 5 of book 2. We'll slow down a little bit by the time that we get to book 3, and we'll spend a couple of weeks on book 3. And then for book 4, which has even more chapters, we'll be spending 3 weeks on that. So in all, it's a 7-week series that I hope we can provide some good information on for you. I also want to note that, using a study guide, is also a part of this series, and hope that some of the notes from it also prove beneficial to you. To launch into this, we always want to start with the author himself. In this case, he was born in 1898 in Ireland, in Belfast, Ireland, and he died in 1963, ironically, on the same day as John F. Kennedy died. And just a point of trivia, John Adams and the president, or the writer of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, also died upon that day. So it's a notable day in history. Unfortunately, I think Lewis's death was probably overshadowed by the assassination of President Kennedy. But that's just a bit of trivia for you. When we look at C.S. Lewis and his story, there's a picture of him. We considered him, people of the time considered him to be one of the most influential writers of the day. Not only was he influential, but some of the people that he associated with that formed a group called the Inklings were also noted and continue to be noted to this day for their writing, one of which was J.R.R. Tolkien, which you may remember from some of your readings in the past too. He was a fellow and tutor in English literature at Oxford University until 1954, when he was unanimously elected to the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. And that was a position that he held until his retirement. So to say that he was intelligent and smart and all that is very much an understatement. But you see where he gained the love of language and the written word. And he's written more than 30 books, everything from this series, which is almost like a Christian apologetics, to books of fantasy. And so Here is where I tell you about Lewis's timeline. And like I said, I invite you to look at that. He was born in 1898 when he was not yet quite 20. His mother died, and he went away to school then after that time. And he would begin to struggle with his faith. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit more. He was raised in a Christian home, though, raised in the Christian faith, but he would deviate from that only to eventually return to it. When we look at the time period in which he's writing this particular, what will become this particular book, like I said, these are a series of radio talks that he gave during wartime, during World War II in London. Now, Lewis himself had fought in World War I. In fact, he was injured in World War I. So when he is speaking to a community that is dealing with war, he's personally engaged in war. He personally knows what it's like on both sides of the war, if you will, to be a soldier and to be a citizen. He's seeing both of those kind of things. And in the early 1940 to 1941, London, where he was living at the time, suffered a huge amount of strikes to London during the Blitz. And then they would have a few-year break, and it would continue again into 44, into 45. That break was while Hitler turned his armies on other forces, but yet the fear hung over London. In fact, so much so that many children who lived in London were sent away from the city of London to live, one of which was Queen Elizabeth and her sister, Margaret, were sent away, for Buckingham Palace was actually bombed at one point. But for the sake of the children, they sent them to live in faraway places from the town of London. So you can imagine the turmoil and time that were going on. Here's a picture of Winston Churchill, who's walking among some of the rubbish that remained after some of those bombings. And here's another picture. If you were to visit London today, what you'll see is a myriad of architecture, those that survived the bombing, those that did not, and sometimes there's just a piece of a wall that will be part of a city street as a remainder and a reminder of that great war. During that period of war, 18,000 tons of explosives were poured out upon London. There were over 30,000 Londoners killed by the bombing, and over 500,000 were injured, and tens of thousands of buildings were destroyed, and a lot of people were left homeless in that. So I tell you all this because this would be the stage in which the BBC would invite him to come and to speak. And so there's a quote in the book that says this: "How strange it must have been to seem to turn on the radio, which was every day bringing news of death and unspeakable destruction, and hear one man talking in an intelligent, good-humored, and probing tone about decent and humane behavior, fair play, and the importance of knowing right from wrong." So you can see, of all the people, why would they choose this particular one to tell about this story? Well, he was not a trained theologian, but he was a layman, and he was actually a former atheist. He spent several years in being an atheist, and like I said, we'll talk about that in a moment. But he says he thinks he was chosen for that very purpose. That he said he has been asked to describe Christianity to a new generation precisely because he was an amateur. He was a beginner and not an old hand. Now, as we move into the book, I think the hardest thing for those of us who are of the faith tradition to try to remember, and for some of us you can't even remember, a time where you knew nothing about faith, where faith was absent from you. You believed that there was nothing outside of what we could see and experience right here. There is no God. There is no idea of a living force. It's just a materialistic view. We're put here, some matter has congregated, it has made humanity, and then it will vanish and it'll go back to dust, and it is all over. Well, I'll confess that I don't understand that because I was reared in a home of Christian faith, and I must say there are moments where I have struggled with faith and understanding. There were times when I've struggled with, well, is God there? But I never doubted the existence that there was God, and I've never doubted, to be truthful, that there was Jesus. because that was my upbringing. But for not everyone is that the same, and not everyone can come back to that. But we, as we enter into this story that C.S. Lewis is doing, he's taking us back to that time as if we knew nothing about faith. And what he is doing is he's building a case for it. You can tell in his speaking that he has wrestled through all the thoughts and the objections and everything associated with faith to come to a conclusion. And yet, unlike many faith traditions that want to just ask you to believe, he takes you through a philosophical argument, if you will, as to why you should believe. And perhaps it's because at some point he is a philosopher that we struggle, because he goes back deeper and deeper and deeper. And he's getting down to the very, very core of what our foundation is. He will tell you in the text that he shies away from any speak of denominational language. He basically wants to bore back down to even before there were denominations. What is it at its basis that we are asked to believe and to acknowledge as we come into Christianity? Not what a set of preferences maybe that a denomination has. If we have those today, it's like the act of communion. Some prefer that it come in a common cup of which we all drink and have certain rituals and liturgy associated with that. Some think, well, if we receive it by intention, it's not the same. Some think if you're not at an altar, if you're not in a church, if you don't have great wine or juice, I mean, the list goes on of what makes true communion. That's just an example of maybe where our beliefs don't separate us as much as our preferences do. The same with baptism. Some will say you're not baptized unless you've been fully immersed. Others will say sprinkling is fine, or pouring on of water. At the same time, the word baptism means the same thing. But you can see how it can become separated by those preferences. And Lewis's point is, can we just go back to what it is and who it is that we respond to? So that's where he's taken us. And that may be a difficult place for you to go if you've not ever struggled with faith. But at the same time, what rich writing to see people who have struggled, who've come from nothing. It wasn't, indoctrinated into them. But what at one point Lewis does is he says, when he's met face to face with, well, I call myself a Christian and I'm not even sure what that means, and he walks away, we see him studying, learning, and in many ways clawing his way back into this rich faith. And maybe it is a much deeper faith than for those of us that haven't had to do it. I don't really know, but we will talk about that a little bit more. So I've told you that he was a Christian. Then he became an atheist, as someone who does not believe in God. And he was about 23 when that happened. And so we think that as young adults struggle with faith, that they're the first generation to do that. Well, they aren't, and they will not continue to be. It'll always be when we ask people to accept this faith that they've grown up in and accepted. At some point, what you hope is that people take their faith out and look at it and examine it and decide to claim that faith for their own. Well, when he reached that age, he rejected all ideas of religion and all ideas of faithfulness and became an atheist. Well, he would be that way for about 18 years. And then he would move back toward the religion when he became a theist. And a theist simply believes that there is something that's supernatural, super powerful, super omnipotent, if you will, but he really doesn't identify it with any kind of religion. There's just some kind of supreme being. And he would stay in that mode until 1940, or when he was about 43, he would swing back and become a Christian once again and profess that. And so it was about a 20-year struggle for him until he came back into the fold of faith. We have called him at times an apologetics, and an apologetic is simply someone who has a reasonable argument or writing, professing and justifying often a religious doctrine. Apologetics isn't always related to religion, but we think of it most times in that terms of where somebody has taken something out, they've read through it, they've looked through it, And through a series of reasonable writings or arguments, they have justified some idea associated with that faith. Some see his book, and this is how I see it, as a book of affirmation. Like I said, I grew up in a Christian home. It was the faith tradition of my family and my family before my family of birth. And for me, when I read these things, it just continues to affirm my faith, because sometimes I didn't know why I believed. But when I see some of these reasoned arguments in writing, I begin to understand why I do believe what I do. And for others, it becomes a set of a place maybe they've not been before. And that is understanding the true basis of Christianity as we now practice it today. But ultimately, for Lewis, and this is jumping ahead just a little bit, what you're going to see in this first book, this is not so much, but as the book goes on, what you see him doing is he's ultimately building this reminder of hope, a hope that is found only in Christ. And he said, it is what Christ asked of us in taking on our humanity, sanctifying our flesh, and asking us in turn to reveal God to one another. What we'll hear Lewis eventually say is that at the very basis, we've been asked to take on the mind of Christ. We are to think like Christ. And when we begin to think like Christ, then we become like Christ, or what we might call the Christ-like image. That until we really embrace all of that, we take that fully into our humanity, and sacrificially understanding that and sanctifying ourselves that we might assume that role, then what we do is we seek to reveal God to one another. And that is our hope. Well, you can imagine the world into which Lewis was speaking as he gave this series of talks. He was speaking to a world that seemed to literally have lost its mind. Literally, the world was on fire as there was battle after battle, first in one country, then in another. There was no region seemingly left unscathed by this march in a world war. And so Lewis's goal was to remind the listener that all hope was not lost. And apparently it made its mark, for these writings would become celebrated, bonded together, packaged in a book that people still buy today. And even though we're not in the midst of a world war, we recognize the world at times to us seems as if it's on fire, that it seems deeply troubled, that it seems deeply divided. And I hear that language still today. And so this is why the news that he brings is still a classic and why it's still important. So the whole call of humanity is to think with the mind of Christ, and in so thinking that we become Christ-like. Toward the end of the book, this is really kind of jumping ahead. It's like reading a book and flipping to the last pages to see how it turns out. But as people coming into this, and I told you we have to go back to when we did not know and work our way toward it. I want you to see where we're headed as we see this argument, this apologetics unfold in Lewis's writing. He says on page 199, this is the whole of Christianity. The church exists for nothing else but to draw humankind into Christ, to make them little Christ. If they're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, and even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. God became human for no other purpose. It is even doubtful you will know whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. So let's think about that for a moment. Why was the whole world created? The whole world was created. The coming of Christ happened so that we might become little Christ, that we might become guardians, caretakers of the earth and of one another. And he says, basically, if we're not doing that, if we're not practicing those Christ-like principles in every way, then whatever your church is doing, whatever the cathedral is doing, whatever your scripture reading is telling you, if you're not enacting it, if you're not being transformed by it, then you're not living up to the purpose for which it was all created. So there's where we're going. So hang on for the ride. Kathleen Norris and writes a preface to the story as she writes these words. The Christianity Lewis espouses is humane, not easy. It asks us to recognize the great religious struggle is not fought on a spectacular battleground, but within the ordinary human heart. When every morning we awake and feel the pressure of the day crowding in on us, and we must decide what sort of immortals we wish to be. Perhaps it helps us, as surely as it helped the war-weary British people who first heard these talks, to remember that God plays a great joke on those who would seek power at any cost. As Lewis reminds us with his customary humor and wit, how monotonously alike are all the great tyrants and conquerors have been, and how gloriously different the saints. Lewis is going to take us back to the whole purpose of our being here, but he's also going to point to us that the reason we struggle is because of what goes on in the human heart, ours and others. And this will be a message for the wartime people who are wondering why things are like they are. And it is a message for us people today as we continue to move on. So as we launch into this, we want to even look at the title to begin. What is mere Christianity? You know, when we use the word mere, sometimes it's a word of diminishment. Oh, it was just a few mere dollars. It was just a trifling thing. It was just a mere effort to improve the situation. We act as if it's little, as if it's nothing, that it's quantitative. Well, that really is not what Lewis means by that. For him, mere means common or essentials of Christianity, not the peripheral or the tangential. Tangential. I'll say this in a minute. Tangential. So, you know, what we're talking about is the things I was talking about. Why do we do this rituals and ceremonies and liturgies we do in the church? What is the basic reason for them? How we do it is not as important as to why we do it. There has to be a reason, an underlying reason that we come back to why we do what we do. Because to be honest, there's no way we can fully mimic Jesus' work in the world. You know, when Jesus is gathered around the table with his people and they're drinking wine out of the common cup and sharing, we can't really go back and duplicate that very scene. Very few churches do that. We're not laying on triclinium couches and we're not, you know, aware, to be honest, exactly what the bread was, what kind of wine was it. We've had people argue over the alcohol content of that wine versus this, and it's not the point, is it? But what are the common or essential things of Christianity that we all need to go back to? And he likens that to this term. He's using an analogy here in the book of the term gentleman. You know, for gentlemen, you know, in the time that it was written, used to mean someone who had a coat of arms and had property. That would be a gentleman. Today, when we refer to someone as a gentleman, we think, well, that means they're honorable and courteous. And it's often not used as a fact of ownership of something. It's actually used oftentimes as a word of praise. Well, the word Christian originally meant a disciple who accepted the apostles' teaching. A Christian was a disciple who accepted the apostles' teaching. We know that it was at the church in Antioch where that term was first originated. But now, when you say if someone is good, then you say they're a Christian. We really don't know if they've accepted the apostles' teaching or not. At the same time, someone who might profess themselves to be a Christian, but then doesn't do something that someone else thinks a Christian ought to do, will say, well, they're not a Christian. Well, Lewis would argue with you and say, well, they're still a Christian. They still believe in what it was the apostles were teaching. They're just a bad one. They're not enacting that part in it. So, we talk about embracing what it is that the apostles taught. But it's also even those who are not yet there doing so. But this is the caution that comes with that. All of those things we just talked about in terms of Christian, who is, who isn't, a good or bad or whatever, require judgment, as or would seem to indicate that we are judging. And Lewis gives you this admonition, if you will. He says, we're not to judge someone's heart, for we're not privy to make those judgments. Instead, he goes on to liken it to being in a hallway with doorways to many rooms. And he says, many will spend much time waiting in the hallway, wondering which room to enter. And he says, some of you may stay in the hallway a long time, that you've heard about all these things related to religion and belief and faith, that you're not really ready to open any of those doors. And he warns that it is a waiting area, not a campground. You just can't stay in that forever. At some point, you have to move into one of the rooms. And he says, when you're walking into these rooms, he says, above all, you must be asking which door is the true one, not which one pleases you best by its paint and paneling. In plain language, the question should never be, do I like that kind of service? But are these doctrines true? Is holiness here? Does my conscience move toward this? Is my reluctance to knock this door due to my pride or by mere taste, or my personal dislike of this particular doorkeeper? Now, I don't know about you, but I imagine that church people throughout the world have just felt like their toes were stepped on, because many of us who have walked in and out of churches might see ourselves in these stories of what he's saying, and particularly in our country where we're a very consumer oriented culture, where we want to go with what pleases us, what's pretty, what seems provocative, what seems enchanting. And he says, what you need to be asking is, are the doctrines within that room true? Is there holiness there? Does it speak to the inner part of my spirit? And do I not go to that place simply because I'm too prideful to walk into it? Or it's something so different, I don't know that I would like the taste of it. Or maybe I've just turned off and don't like that idea that I would be in that particular room. He also offers an admonition for those who have found their room. He says, when you've reached your room, be kind to those who've chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, they need your prayers all the more. And if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. That is one of the common rules of the whole house. Well, each of us has to take a step back. I recall hearing a quote of C.S. Lewis many years ago, and it was something to this, this phraseology. But he said, whenever you complain about people who are in the room of the church, the walls of the church, pause and ask yourself, well, what would they be if they weren't in the walls of the church? Meaning the fact that they've moved into the room gives opportunity for growth and grace, forgiveness and mercy, and above all, understanding. What CS is not proposing is any denomination, any particular faith walk. He's asking for patience as everyone comes into the hall and figures out, where is it that they feel like they're best learning the truth? What is it that the Holy Spirit is speaking to? And to encourage them to enter the room, that pride or some dislike of something else there does not keep them away. So that's the preface as we move into this first book. And so what I want to do is just simply point out some key, and what I think and the study guide thinks are the key points of this particular book and chapter. And we go back to really the basic foundations of all civilizations. Every civilization has some sense of what's right and wrong, what's permissible within that culture and what is not permissible within that culture. It doesn't matter if it's tribalism or if it's a very civilized society. There is a sense of right and wrong, and there's tribal groups that will shun certain people who don't meet that particular criteria, just as we in civilization will point out what we think is someone is wrong in the current civilization. There's something innate within groups that teach them that there's a difference between what is good, what is bad, or what we might say, what is right and what is wrong. It is something geared within our humanity. We get a sense, if you will, of one of those two things. And when people disagree or quarrel, it's because they are appealing to some kind of a standard of behavior that the other person should have known. So simply because they're a part of this humanity, they should have known that what they were doing was wrong. And if they're disagreeing about that, well, no, it's not wrong what I'm doing. And this one's saying, yes, it is. You can see where conflict occurs. So we're going back to the very basic of what creates conflict. And the creation is a disagreement over right and wrong at the end of the day. Look at all, let's just go down to children. What does children squabble about? He took my toy. It's a sense of fairness, isn't it? You should know you don't take a toy from someone else. And the other person has said, but I deserve that toy. I'm older, I'm stronger, I'm whatever. And a quarrel ensues. And so you should have known that you don't do that. And the other person is fighting back, saying, I don't like that rule. I don't like that the standard that's been set there. And so in the past, they called these the law of nature or the law of human nature. Some people also call it the moral law. And so we're going to be calling that for the purposes of the study, the law of human nature, as opposed to the law of nature, which we've kind of changed as we've gone throughout time, because these two are now different. When we talk about the law of nature, we're not talking about what's right and wrong. We're talking about things which are uh, like the law of nature, things like gravity, physics, things that you can't change if you want to. There is no choice of obedience or disobedience. If I take a rock and I hold it up and then I remove my hand, I can't command that the rock not fall because it has no choice because of the law of gravity to simply fall to the ground. But in the law of human nature, it's the one law that we get choices in. Are we going to be obedient or are we going to be disobedient? And if we agree that there's this law by which we know right from wrong, the question we often have to ask ourselves is why do we fail to practice it? Or what we may say, practice what we preach. And what we find in human nature is that we want everyone else to obey the law, but sometimes we think we're um, freed from it, that we shouldn't have to. And this is when you see a lot of excuses and reasons coming up for why they disagree with that. In that story that I just gave you of the two children, isn't that what we heard? One who says, it's not right to take someone's toy, and the child's son, but I wanted it. There's their reason why they do that. They want you to play fair, but this child doesn't want to play fair. Well, unfortunately, that never stops. And we also get into arguments because we have an expectation. I expected you to be this way. And then when you fail to meet those expectations of what I perceive to be right, then we've got a problem. And now you know why arguments ensue. So the question is, we know we have this sense of right or wrong, and yet none of us operate by it fairly. None of us have not at some point decided that we either disagreed with that particular one or we just didn't want to play by that. It was too hard to practice. It was too hard to keep up with. Let me give you a case strictly out of the Bible. Let's just go back to the Ten Commandments. Now, maybe most of you listening here have not done what, most of the 10, but I guarantee you that you've done some of them. Now, that not killing people, maybe not stealing, some of those are easy to keep. But I come back to it, and it's kind of like the law of human nature that God asks us to constantly observe is this one about coveting something that our neighbors have. And yet, who amongst us has not experienced times of envy, almost to the point of destruction of what somebody else has, that people will send themselves into great debt at times because they're envious of what others have with things that they want. What about that one that says about respecting and honoring your parents? Well, there's very few teenagers amongst us who haven't done something that in some way disrespected their parents. Then what about keeping a Sabbath day, resting and worshiping on the Sabbath day? I'm afraid we're all probably guilty of that too. So we profess that we believe in the Ten Commandments. We see them as our moral law, and yet we don't always practice what we preach. And so this is where this chapter ends, and this sets the stage for the ensuing conversation. And it's these 2 points. At our innermost being, we know what's right and what's wrong. And yet we often don't do what's right, although we expect other people to do it. That's the first chapter, and that's where we end in that one. So when we move from that, uh, Lewis does what apologists do. It's like an imaginary argument, if you will. He comes up with this hypothesis that we know the difference between right and wrong, and despite sometimes our best efforts, we do wrong, but we get really angry when other people do. We expect everyone else to always do right. And so he's saying, well, some of you may object to my hypothesis that we know the difference between right and wrong. And so he's going to offer 2 examples of some objections to that people know the difference between right and wrong. And the first objection that people might give back to him is this: isn't the law of human nature just an innate or inbred herd instinct? Meaning, where do we get that sense of right and wrong? Oh, it's just born in us. We just know that. We just know that it's inbred or herd instinct, if you will. And so, and some of that is true. We talk about mother's instinct a lot, don't we? We talk about the desire for sexual activity as an instinct for food, and they prompt our impulses and desires. Of course, they do. But the difference is that a moral law is perceived to as an ought. An instinct is perceived as a want, desire, or impulse. Now, it's like this. Yes, there is a sexual desire instinct amongst us, but we don't have, we can't just because we desire it and have an impulse for it, go anywhere we want and fulfill sexual pleasure. That would not be a good use of that, would it? But somewhere along the line, we've learned moral law that says that instinct ought to be only used in these situations. And so we come then a case against rape. We come then for some religious groups, a case against premarital sexual desire. We come up with the cases where we think that that is correct because at our inner being, we know that there's a moral law that says what we ought to do. And then we can't always act on that herd instinct of our own want, desire, or impulse. He says, well, what would happen if we had 2 opposing instincts, but no inner moral law? Which one will we answer to? So we've got these instincts that tell us to do these things, and now they're, in conflict with one another. Well, how do you make a decision? Well, the decision as to which one you're going to respond to is based upon some other logic that comes into play, which is generally moral law. So, the 2 are wrestling with each other. In some way, you choose one instinct over another because you know. And so let's go back to, let's say there is someone and they're addicted to pornography and they think that they just, are going to engage in watching pornographic material all the time. And yet, there's some moral law that's coming up and saying, and telling them, well, you can't act upon that instinct. And so these 2 are in conflict. And how you decide upon that is because of what the moral law that's at the basis of what you're going to do says about that. And he said, and the other thing is not, no an impulse or instinct is always good. Let's take some positive ones. A mother's instinct. A mother's instinct to come alongside, nurture, care, protect, and oversee her child's care is a beautiful one. Done healthfully, it's a beautiful one. But there's a time when a mother's protectiveness has to let go in order for that child to become a full functioning independent adult. The one who decides that I need to go to school with you and help you on your test, or I need to go away with you to college to make sure you pick the right friends, or I need to go with you to the job interview because I don't want somebody to take advantage of you. is an impulse that is not good, right? And so we see that. Now here's another one. Let's think of patriotism. I love patriotism. I love my country. I love the freedoms that my country offers. But when I let patriotism mean that I'm going to move out and squash anybody else who thinks otherwise, and it's going to create in me hatred, a division, then I might have to back up and think about that. Or if patriotism calls me into a fight that is not for a cause that matches my moral code. So we can see, well, what does that mean? And perhaps the January 6th turmoil at the Capitol building was an example of maybe an instinct that wasn't being fully used as it should have been. And so we have to remember that at the center of it all, there has to be some guide as to what, even in the instinct, we act upon and which do we defer, delay, or put aside. Well, the second objection that he says some might raise is, well, isn't the moral code then just simply a social convention, something that's learned by education, for example? Well, it is true that our society teaches us and our parents teach us that there's appropriate things to do. I remember when our daughter was about 5 years old, I decided that she and I would go for mother-daughter luncheon, and we went to the apple cake tea room, which is a little tea room in our community. And she sat at the table, and I leaned over and I said, "Now you need to put your napkin in your lap." And she leaned back and she says, "Is this a rule here?" And so she was learning social convention. She was learning what was a proper way to eat. And I can recall growing up, my mother telling me certain things that young women should and should not do. One of the rules in our house was that, I could never be in a car with more boys than girls. It was a social convention because she was watching over me. She wanted to make sure I didn't go down a road where my reputation might be ruined or I'll be perceived as something less than she desired for me to be. We learn those things. I think of men walking into buildings and taking their hats off. That's a convention of society, isn't it? In our culture, we reach across and shake people's hands, or at least we did before COVID. Yet, not in all social conventions does that happen. So, that is true. We learn some of these things that are good or bad from our things. And there's other things that we learn simply because they're real truths. And an example of that's mathematics. I don't care how many times I put two objects here and two objects here that I don't have four objects. There's no way, new math or any other way, that it's going to come up any other. It's hard and fast. And that stays hard and fast, whether anybody ever taught me that or not. It is a truth that happens to be there. But but he says there's really two reasons why moral law isn't social convention and or by education. And he uses this example. He says there's differences between moral ideas of two countries or two different time periods that are not that great, but the differences in the conventions are. So let's just take an example. When my children were growing up, we read a book by Peter Spear called People. And in this book, he would talk about cultures all over the world. In some cultures, they eat this, and in other cultures, they eat that. In some cultures, they wear earrings that cause their lobes to droop down, the further the better, or necklaces that cause their necks to be stretched and taut. In some cultures, they wear less clothing than in other cultures. And so, it would look like there's there's differences between those two. And it would seem that the moral code is different, but it's really not. It's their social conventions that are different within those two. We also notice that in time periods that different conventions change. If you were living in the 1600s and you ran into a store and picked up a loaf of bread, social convention would tell you that you either lost your hand, that you were put in the stockade in the town center for people to jeer at and throw things at if you wanted. Well, when we move into our century, we would not think of having that in a town square now, would we? The convention that was the punishment for that crime is not the same convention as it is today. Another thing is he said, you know, uh, It's not a convention, because if one set of morals is better than another set, like, well, let's go back to those cultures where women maybe don't wear tops. And this was probably an era of the early missionary people, that they went into Indian communities or Native communities, and they began to instruct them in that those people were living immorally because they were not clad as well as they were, or their hair needed to be cut or whatever. And so we've got two moral standards then, because for those cultures that was correct. And so, if you've got these two and you think one's better than the other, by what basis are you making that decision? By what basis are you making that? So we said it's not convention, because what we find within that is there is a basic understanding. And what we've learned, let's just look at the missionary thing, that no group of people has a right to go into another culture and to mandate what they eat, what they wear, and those kind of things, because if within that culture they've considered their own of what's moral and right. And where do they get that? So that's what we're coming back to. So what he does, he gives you this hypothesis in the first chapter that basically says there is a basic right or wrong, and we don't want to practice it. In the second chapter, he's defending that first point. There is a set of right and wrong. When we move into the third chapter, he rolls back around and he considers those two things again, the two odd things about the human race, that we're haunted by the notion of some sort of behavior we ought to practice, and this whole notion of fair play or decency or morality or the law of human nature. And then the second thing is we don't always live up to that notion. No matter how much we profess it, we have trouble. It reminds me of people, if you've ever met someone and they begin to complain at length about what someone else is or isn't doing, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, that sounds a lot like you. And it's that kind of buys into that, is they're faulting the very things that they don't practice of themselves, but they're asking somebody else to do that. Well, C.S. Lewis says, I don't want to take time to talk about blame. Why don't we do it? I don't want to talk about, well, they just weren't reared properly. They came from a bad home. They never had a chance, on and on and on, because I don't want to talk about blame. He's more interested in the why. He's more interested in the why than anything. And the reason is he wants to find out what's the basic truth about this. And not only find that out, but if we don't obey these basic moral codes, these basic moral laws, is there any consequence? So if we don't do what we know we ought to do, he uses this word a lot, ought to, then is there a consequence for that? And maybe it's that word ought that reminds us of every time we say that, we're passing an understanding of some judgment that we know within ourselves we ought to. It's kind of tickles me sometimes in the life of the church. I hear this a lot. Someone really ought to, and then fill in the blank, whatever that may be. Maybe you've used that in your home or in your workplace. And what we're always trying to do is we're expecting someone else to do something, but we don't think we ought to be the one to do that. And so, that leads us into this conversation of, well, how does this ought to work? And he says, well, two different acts can be equally inconvenient to oneself while being completely opposite in terms of ought or decent behavior. And he uses this example of getting a seat on a train. He says, one man gets the seat versus the other man who moves someone's bag and sits in the seat while their back is turned. Now, which one of those are ought? Both of them are inconvenient. I've got to get on, I've got to get a seat, I've got to do this. But which one did the thing that they ought not have done? Well, we would say, so well, you ought not have moved his bag, while someone else was waiting on that seat. In other words, they called the seat and you've took it. Well, I don't know about you, but in my house with teenagers, that was often a battle. I told you I was coming back to that seat, and you ought to have not gotten into it, right? And so, we talk about those things. And so it introduces to us this word of tautology. Now, let me give you an example. And this is out of his book, so I can kind of show it here. It says, he says, one might ask, why ought I be unselfish? The answer is for society. Then one might ask, well, why should I care about society except if it benefits me? And the answer is because you ought to be unselfish. You see, this is like a dog with its tail in its mouth. It's going around and around. And that is what tautology is. It's saying the same thing over and over again without giving a reason. It's just like, well, you just ought to know. You just ought to know. It's like having an argument with a 2-year-old, isn't it? So why do I have to go to bed? Because you're tired. Why am I tired? Because you're not in bed. Why do I have to go to bed? Because you're tired. And it goes on and on and on, right? So you maybe have been in those. And that's what he says the reality of the law is that's why we don't get into the blame game or to understanding that. He said, really, where the ought comes from is something that's totally separate from everything else. Where do we get the understanding or desire for what things ought to be? Well, what is the baseline that establishes what's the very baseline? This is right, this is wrong. What is the barometer that we use to decide which is right and which is wrong? And he's coming to this conclusion that it's something that we can't see. It's a law that's beyond all the other laws. It's not the law of nature that has to be obedient. And it's really beyond the law of human nature that's making this choice because we're going back to the basic of, well, then what's the foundation? Who or what is it? There's something separate from us that determines that, and it is apart from our biological instincts, our desires, and apart from anything that we might have learned that socially we've been taught. So, where do we get the understanding or desire for what things ought to be? So, do you see us turning towards something? Well, he backs up again and he says, well, let's go back and let's look at the 3 different views about how the world came about. Now, there are more views than this, but these are the 3 most predominant. And one is the materialistic view, which says there's nothing behind the universe. Matter and space just happen to exist and have always existed. Matter behaves in a certain fixed way, which by some fluke or chance happen to produce us, creatures who think. Imagine that. So I've heard it compared to I've taken a bunch of parts of a watch, I threw them up into the air, and they came back to Earth as a ticking timepiece. Don't know how it happened. It can just now do its job. And that's the materialist that out of some kind of matter, dust, whatever, humanity was formed. And because it was formed, it could suddenly do things it could not do when it was unformed. That's the materialistic view. And then I've showed you below what evolutionists, Darwinian evolutionists, secular humanists, and Marxian materialists, they fall into this category. This is what they believe. And there are people walking right now who believe that they're created from some unknown place. And when this life is over, this life is over. That's it. It's just whatever pulled matter together breaks down and there is no more matter. Well, when we move to the religious view, they believe that there's something like a mind behind the universe. It is conscious and it has purpose and preferences. And most who are in any sort of religious point of view believe this, that there's something greater beyond ourselves that has a mind and it creates the world for some greater purpose or preference. And then one that in probably the last few centuries has gained some thought too is this what they call a life force view. And this is probably in a theistic kind of way of thinking that there's some kind of force behind the universe, but it is without purposes or preference. It's just only chance. If it has purposes, then it is like a mind. And this view has all the thrills of the religious view, but none of the cost. It's just wishful thinking. And so when you look at Lewis's life, he started out with the religious view, he went to the materialistic view, and then he went back over to the life force view, and then he came back to the religious view again. Because what makes the religious view different is that there is some being, some omnipotent being that has a mind and has a purpose for the creation of the world as we know it. For those who think, well, there is a thing there, but it really doesn't have anything to do with what's going on at the moment. Some might think that deism comes into this, which is the belief that there was a God who set everything in motion and then walked away and thought, well, we'll just see kind of how this ends, and it does not have a hand in it anymore. So when we look at those views about how the world came about, what Lewis is taking us back to is the only thing that, and there's not one thing, and the only thing is man or humanity. He says, we don't merely observe humanity, we are men or women. It is the one and only thing that we can know more than anything we have ever known from mere external observational knowledge. We can think about those other things, and we can, but the only place that we can really understand is humanity, our humanity, and we attempt to understand the humanity of other people. I don't know if you can sense it here, but we're moving, because who else became human but God Himself as He walked among people as Jesus? And so we're moving. We're talking about that something beyond. And then we're talking about that relatable part of how do we as human relate to this something beyond. And you can see the philosophy unfolding within this. Well, as we finish this first book, he entitles this last chapter, We Have Cause to Be Uneasy. And he said, because the law of human nature, when we think about that, and we get these ideas of what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, it's almost as if we're getting letters from some material universe, something that is trying to trigger us into how we respond and how it is that we set the moral law for what is right and wrong. He said that sounds a little bit like a trick or religion wrapped up with philosophy and logic. And he said, it's not. It's if it turns out to be that, then we've got bigger problems. But what he's kind of saying is he says we can't just rely on religious talk, or he calls it religious jaw. He says we are not getting our knowledge from churches or Bibles, but rather just our own steam if we don't relate back to this bigger idea, this non-materialistic view. We're just kind of operating on our own, aren't we? And so we don't want to find ourselves in that. The other danger that we have is that, well, we see this beautiful world around us, but it's beautiful, but it could be cruel. What is it that's going to guide people's sense of right and wrong if it's just left as a materialistic world to just dangle here on its own? And this second bit is the ought within us. Well, we know that that's there, but just because it's there doesn't mean we have to obey it at all. If we don't know or think that there's something beyond ourselves guiding us in that, because then I'll just do whatever I want to do, believing it's what I ought to do. And I would have little care for what you thought of it. So he said, if the universe is not governed by absolute goodness, then all our efforts are in the long run hopeless, kind of like playing Russian roulette. If there isn't absolute goodness behind the law of human nature, then it won't bother about or disapprove of human greed, exploitation. If at our core there's not goodness, what difference does it make what we do and how we do it? And everything is Russian roulette. We're just playing the odds of how long we can milk and get out of it in our own life. But he said, if the universe is governed by absolute goodness, then we're also hopeless, because we daily make ourselves an enemy of the goodness behind the ought or law of human nature. Because if we make just one mistake, we failed, and it is unlikely that we'll ever improve. Absolute goodness then is supreme terror. So, what he means, by this, I think, is that, if it's goodness and we make one mistake, then there's no hope for us. We've blown everything. We have no chance. Well, that should leave us in a life of terror, looking over our shoulder as to when the end is going to come. And so he states that he chose this roundabout matter to get his real subject. Because what he's wanting us to see is that if you can't understand those two things, Christianity makes no sense. Only when you know you're in violation of what is absolute goodness and the power behind that law does Christianity begin to speak. In other words, we begin to understand why we have a need. All humanity has a need to know the source of absolute goodness and the hope as we struggle because we don't always do what is absolutely good. Well, that ends our first book today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's caused you to continue to ponder and to wonder. And next, I invite you back for the next session where we'll be talking about, of all things, Christian behavior. And so, or excuse me, not behavior, what Christians believe. We'll do behavior the next time. So, what Christians believe. So, I think you'll enjoy that as well. So, I hope you've gotten some nuggets of truth out of this, and I look forward to seeing you next time as we move into Mere Christianity.